the loop slides. Brian? Oh, good. Switched over. Welcome. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney, and we welcome you to the National Archives Know Your Records program. The Know Your Records program teaches you about federal records and how to do historical or genealogical research using U.S. federal records. So we are broadcasting live here in the Washington, D.C. building of the National Archives. And because we're broadcasting live, I have a few instructions for you on how to participate in today's event. So thank you for joining us here, the live audience on site. We will take your questions at the very end of the presentation. We just ask that you stand up and use these aisle microphones so that we can capture your voice for the video. For those of you who are joining us during the live broadcast, you can also participate. We ask that you first log in to the chat section, and then you can type your questions into the chat, and we'll respond to those questions at the end of the presentation. You will also find on this YouTube webpage several hot links. One will take you to the presentation slides, a handout, and there's also live captioning. Hopefully, we're expecting the live captioning in a moment. And you'll also find an event evaluation form. And for those of you who are here with us, I hope that you've picked up the handouts. So there's an event evaluation form included in that. So now on to today's program entitled Digitizing 26LG Coast Guard Lighthouses. And our presenter is Kelsey Noel. Ms. Noel is a processing archivist in the Still Picture branch located in College Park, Maryland. She began working at the National Archives in 2014, and she tells me that she can't imagine working anywhere else. She has a Bachelor's of Art in Historic Preservation and Museum Studies from the University of Mary Washington and a Master of Science in Libraries and Information Science with a concentration on cultural heritage, information management from the Catholic University of America. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Kelsey Noel.
Good afternoon. My name is Kelsey Noel, and I'm a processing archivist in the Still Picture branch, which is located in College Park, Maryland. And I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you guys about 26LG, Coast Guard lighthouses, and the digitization thereof. Before I get started, though, I need to make a couple of very important disclaimers. One, I am not a Coast Guard historian, and two, I am not a lighthouse historian. I was, however, very involved in the process of getting these photographs digitized and made available online through the National Archives catalog, which you see right here. And that's the process that I'm particularly excited to be able to talk to you guys about today, along with, to what extent I can, the records themselves and the photographic processes in the series. So with that out of the way, I'd like to talk a little bit about what I mean when I refer to the series as 26LG. 26LG, so where do I get the 26? The 26 is the record group number. That is the numerical code that the National Archives as a whole has chosen to use when referring to records of the U.S. Coast Guard and its predecessor agencies. What I mean by that is there may be times in this record group where you find records that predate the Coast Guard's involvement in a particular activity, or even potentially the Coast Guard itself. They're still considered Coast Guard records because at some time in those records' history, they became the responsibility of the U.S. Coast Guard. The U.S. Coast Guard maintained them, used them, preserved them, transferred them over to the National Archives. They functionally became U.S. Coast Guard records, and we preserve them in the archives as U.S. Coast Guard records. That doesn't mean that we ignore where the records originally came from. The history of the records or the provenance of them is very important. So we do maintain the knowledge that these records may have been created before the Coast Guard was involved in their maintenance and use. So that is where we get 26. That's the record group number. Where do we get LG? LG is the alphabetical code that the still picture branch has chosen to use when specifically referring to these particular Coast Guard photographs, as opposed to the other photographs in our holdings. So together, 26LG makes up our local identifier, which you can see right here on the screen, the local identifier, and that's a very important little code. That code is how you, if you ever want to go back and find these photos again, look at them, research them, talk to somebody else about them, you really need to know the local identifier because it is the most precise and concise way of referring to this series. So what is in 26LG? The series is described as containing lighthouses, aids to navigation, and miscellany created for and or by the Lighthouse Service and its predecessor agencies. Photographs show views of light structures, surrounding areas, shorelines, and depict the living conditions of keepers and their families and of maintenance personnel. There are views showing construction of buildings and the installation of lights and light structures at forts, memorial lights, lightships, and portraits of keepers. So you can notice in the slideshow that I'm showing you right now, a lot of these photos, probably all of the photos, come with a caption to them. And that's important to know about the captions. It's important to know that those captions were not created by the National Archives or anybody at the National Archives. Those captions were created long before the records ever came to us, and they are therefore considered part of the historical record, and we preserve them as such. Something else that was created or established before the records came to us would be the arrangement. So by arrangement, I mean the order in which the photographs are stored. This series is arranged in a fairly interesting way. The photographs are arranged by Coast Guard district number, and each district number corresponds with a specific geographical location. And then within that district number, they're arranged in loose alphabetical order by lighthouse name. So that's the physical arrangement in the boxes of the photos, and that physical arrangement is reflected in how we arranged the digital images as well. You can use or you can find our digital images in two different ways. If you are to visit us in our research room in College Park, Maryland, you can check out a hard drive and look at our photographs, the 26LG digital photographs there. And this is kind of a screen grab of what you would find on the hard drive. So there's a file for 26LG. If you open that up, you'll see files that are listed, and each file is a box number, and then within each box number, you'll open it up and you'll find all of the photos that are in that box. It's pretty much a one-for-one copy of the actual physical arrangement of the boxes. You can also find the photos on the National Archives catalog online, and that reflects the physical arrangement as well, but we have sort of eliminated the box numbers, and instead we've just gone with the geographical location, as you can see on the right side of the screen. Oh, it's your left side of the screen. So that is sort of a good overview of what 26LG, the mechanics of it, some of the specifics of it. But we haven't talked about how old the photos are, which is pretty important. So record group 26 at the National Archives as a whole, not just in still pictures and not for 26LG, those records, they span a couple hundred years between 1785 and 2005. The photographs in 26LG are not quite that old. primarily because you would be hard-pressed to find photographs from 1785 of anything anywhere, considering photographic technology was not invented until 1839. That being said, the photographs in 26LG are quite old for photos. They were created between 1855 and 1933. 1855 is only about 16 years after the development of photographic technology, which makes these photos very old. And this years that these photos were taken, they represent a very interesting period of time, not just in terms of Lighthouse history in the United States, but also in terms of the history of photographic development, technological development, I mean. So that is represented in the series itself. We have a number of different kinds of photographic processes from the fairly early era of photographic technology, and it kind of creates a cool little timeline almost of photographic technological development. We have, for example, albumin prints. Albumin prints were invented, that's a process that was invented in the 1850s, and it involves using egg whites to create a layer on the photographic paper on which the image is created. It does use silver to sensitize the photo paper to light, which is a very common way of sensitizing photographic paper. We also have collodion prints. This process was developed, well, it was originally created in about 1851, but it wasn't successfully applied to paper photographs until the 1860s, and then it didn't gain popularity as a process until the 1880s. We have cyanotypes. Cyanotypes happen to be my personal favorite form of photographic process. This was a process invented in the 1840s. It gained popularity in the 1890s, and it uses iron complexes to create the photographic image, and that turns the photographs a really incredible shade of blue, which is why it's my favorite photographic process, because blue is my favorite color. They're very beautiful, but they are extremely fragile. Those photographs, cyanotypes, if you expose them to light, even just regular light, maybe like we have here today, for any length of time, a couple of hours, the photographs start to disappear. A couple of days and they're just gone forever. So we, in addition to those very, very old forms of photographic process, we also have silver gelatin printing out, which was invented in the 1880s. And we have silver gelatin developing out, which was invented in the 1880s and 90s. It gained popularity in the 90s. The difference between silver gelatin printing out and silver gelatin developing out is that printing out uses just light exposure to create the photographic image, whereas developing out uses light exposure and then the addition of chemicals to create the photographic image. They both use silver to sensitize the paper to light, and they both use a gelatin layer, which was a pretty big step forward in photographic technology. In that gelatin layer, that's where the image particles are suspended. And silver gelatin developing out is the process that we still use today to create modern black and white photographic prints. So this is definitely why this series is so interesting to me as a photo archivist, but it's not the only reason that the age of the photos makes them fascinating. As I hope many people here or listening today will know, the U.S. Coast Guard didn't actually become responsible for the administration of lighthouses in the United States until 1939. And we've already talked about how the newest photos in this series were taken in 1933, which is 6 years before the Coast Guard became responsible for the care and maintenance and construction of lighthouses. And we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but if you don't remember why they're considered Coast Guard records anyway, I'm going to repeat it so nobody has to worry. We consider them Coast Guard records because when the lighthouses became the responsibility of the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard also took over responsibility of this series, and they used it and maintained it and eventually transferred it over to us at the National Archives. And that's reflected in the series. For example, it is arranged by U.S. Coast Guard district number. Sorry. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of lighthouses in the United States in order to go into more detail about more about their provenance, because it's very interesting. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that today, August 7th, 2018, is the 229th anniversary of the 9th Act of the First Congress, which created the lighthouse establishment under the Department of Treasury and brought the 12 colonial lighthouses in existence at the time under federal control. In 1852, the Lighthouse establishment was replaced by the Lighthouse Board, and then the Lighthouse Board was moved under the Department of Commerce in 1903. Department of Commerce and Labor, excuse me. In 1910, the Lighthouse Board was replaced by the Lighthouse Service, or Bureau of Lighthouses, and then in 1913, when Commerce and Labor split, it was moved under the Department of Commerce. In 1939, the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, became responsible for the administration of lighthouses in the United States, and that's where the responsibility still lies today. So now I'd like to change gears and talk a little bit about digitization. So at the National Archives, we take digitization very seriously, and I know because we take making access happen very seriously. And digitization is not the only way that we make access happen, but it is a very important way. And we work very hard, I know, in still pictures to make sure that we get our records out to the public through the National Archives catalog. The problem that we face is that we have millions of photos, and it's just impossible to digitize them all at the same time and get them all available all at once. That means that we need to prioritize our series. We need to select which series will go first. In order to do that, we have to consider a couple of different things. We think about how old the photos are. We think about what condition the photographs are in. And we think about their research value. If photos have high research value, for example, we know that many researchers need or want access to a series, those photos will be prioritized. Those are the criteria that we did consider when we selected 26LG for digitization. We've already talked about how these are old photographs. Older photographs have high intrinsic value or innate value, but they also require more careful handling and care because as photos age, they grow more fragile. 26LG, by the way, this is a collodion print. In 26LG, we'll have a lot of photographs that it's just not safe to expose to a flatbed scanner, or it's not safe to expose them to a camera flash like the cyanotypes. I think I called them collodion earlier. There's definitely cyanotypes because they are blue. It's not safe to expose them to a camera flash. That really restricts how our researchers were able to interact with this series because they were not able to make their own digital copies. By digitizing the records ourselves using specialized equipment and specialized expertise, we're able to provide our researchers with digital copies that they may not have otherwise been able to acquire. This is definitely good for our researchers, but it's also good for our photographs because it means that we don't need to pull them as often and serve them in the research room. It means we can protect our original photographs from unnecessary handling, additional light exposure, the possibility of accidents, because accidents do and can happen. And it means that even though we cannot stop deterioration entirely, we can slow it way down and preserve the information and the photographs themselves for the future. Above all, we do digitize for access. We digitize so that we can make our photographs available to the public online through the National Archives catalog. And this series, 26LG, was prioritized especially because it has very high research value in addition to the preservation concerns and the age of the photos. We know that this series was very important for a lot of people, from lighthouse historians and Coast Guard historians to people doing local history projects and even potentially family history projects. That made this series a perfect candidate for digitization, which is why we digitized it. But digitization is not as quick and easy as one might think. It's actually it seems very simple. It's deceptively simple in its appearance. It's actually quite a time-consuming multi-step process if you want to have a good product at the end. We need to start with selecting our series, which we've already talked about. But once you've selected your series, you cannot jump straight to the digitization step. You have to do other things. For example, we would need to define our specifications for the project. By that, I mean we need to pick what file formats we're going to digitize to, what resolution we're going to digitize at. We need to decide how we're going to name the files we create so that every file has a unique name. And those are just a couple of examples of the kinds of decisions that need to go into a project before we start digitizing. Once that's done, we can start preparing our materials. So a very technical term for the physical images is the analog photos. So we need to prepare the analog photos for the process of digitization. And that can be as simple as taking the boxes off the shelf and sending them down to the lab to get digitized, but it's usually a lot more complicated. It can be as complicated as identifying preservation concerns and deciding how and when you're going to address them. Once the materials are prepped, then you can send the photos down to the lab to get digitized. And this is, at this step, some photos we can digitize on a flatbed scanner. Some photos we need to use a camera and digitize from above. If we have really big stuff like posters or panoramas, they might need to be scanned or digitized using specialized equipment, which I personally think is extremely cool, very fun, very exciting. But it is a step that it does tend to take the most time in the digitization process, which makes sense because the point of a digitization project is to digitize things. And once everything is digitized, we then have to go back and do a QC. We need to quality control and check our work because we need to make sure we haven't skipped anything, that we haven't taken photos that are fuzzy, that all of the naming system, that it's been done correctly. If we find mistakes, we do have to go back and correct our mistakes. And when that's finished, our photos are ready, but we're not done. We also need to work on metadata. So I'll talk a little bit about metadata throughout the rest of the project. Metadata is, that is essentially just the intellectual information that is associated with the photos that lends the photos and the images meaning. A very classic example of metadata would be the caption. But a caption is not the only kind of metadata that we have. We can also have the date a photo was taken or the agency that took the photo. And metadata also includes the local identifier number. So we've talked about the local identifier number in terms of this series as a whole, 26LG. But when we digitize, we do give, I think I might have jumped ahead in my presentation, but that's okay. When we digitize, we do give everything a local identifier number, and I'll come back to that later. But the metadata is all very important because without it, we don't have the context for the photo. We don't have the context that makes the photo make sense. So sometimes we get metadata from the agency when they send their analog photos over. They might send over an item list as well. And that's great because but it's also very rare. So most often when we do metadata, we need to compile it ourselves. So we compile the metadata, we put it into a format that the catalog can read and make sense of so that we can deliver it to our researchers in a way that they can access the metadata associated with each specific image. And it is the final step in our process of digitization. So once the metadata is complete, we can send all of our digital images and we can send all of our metadata to the catalog. It gets put online and then anybody can access it if they have internet. So how long a digitization project takes is that's an open-ended question. There's really no rule of thumb because it depends on a lot of different things. For example, if you have a series with a lot of photos in it, it's going to take longer than a series with only a few photos. A series that has 8,000 photos is going to take longer to do the digitization work than a series with only 80. We also have to consider what file format or what resolution we've chosen, because larger files, they just take longer to create and work with. Those are sort of internal kind of reasons why a series might take a long time to digitize, but there are also external reasons. Digitization is important to everybody at the National Archives, not just still picture branch. So there are going to be times when many different branches and many different divisions have asked the digitization staff to do projects, and sometimes projects that are from other branches and other divisions are going to take a priority, and that's okay, because eventually all digitization projects do get completed, and it's okay if it takes a long time, but usually it'll take at least a couple of months, if not more. So in terms of 26LG specifically, we digitized these photographs as high-resolution JPEGs and TIFFs. So JPEG and TIFF, those are just different image file formats. JPEGs are much more common. TIFFs tend to be really huge. And we digitized the photos to be between, at a resolution of between 500 and 600 ppi. We also captured all of the captioning information. So we captured it in one of two ways. Either we digitized it and transcribed it, or we just transcribed it. So in our example here, you can see that we digitized the photograph as well as the board it's mounted on. That's just a piece of cardboard, and you can see that the captioning information and the metadata was written around the photo. So in this case, we digitized the whole thing, and then we also transcribed the information. But in some cases, we would have just digitized the photo itself, and then you can still access the captioning and the metadata. It's been transcribed, and it's available in the catalog. So at the end of the project, we had about 8,000 images created, which is a big series, a big digitization series. It's about a medium size series for still pictures. We have bigger ones, we have a lot of smaller ones, but it's a decent sized digitization project. And the great news about 26LG is that the photos are in the public domain. This means that you should have no trouble using them. And the classic, most obvious way that you might use them is if you were going to put them in a book, if you were going to use them as illustrations. But the ways that you can use them are endless, because if you are a crafty person, you can come up with all kinds of ideas. I am not a crafty person, and I still have ideas. You can do things like you can download them directly out of the catalog and print them out and use them as decoration. I've seen people online use photos to create coasters. I think that that would make a cool Christmas gift. I don't know. I think that there are all kinds of ways that you can use the photos that we have digitized, because we have digitized them so they'll be used. We do ask, though, that if you choose to use our records, you would please cite them. And citing them is very important, so that if you ever want to go back and find the photo again, or somebody else wants to find that photo, they'll have a direct path specifically to this photo. Citing them would include saying National Archives Still Picture Branch, but this is where that local identifier number for the photographs comes in and is very important. So this is a screenshot of what the catalog looks like for an item entry for this particular photo. And this is where you'll find the local identifier number. Is it going to come up? There we go. So the local identifier number, 26LG is the local identifier for this series, but each photo gets its own number because we need to distinguish this photo from all the others in the catalog and all the others in the series. So when you cite our photos, we would ask that you use the local identifier number, because otherwise it gets very difficult to trace back to the photo, and it becomes very difficult to find it again. And then this is where you'll find the caption. So we transcribe the captions. So if you're looking for the caption in the series, you can find it down here. So I think I have one more. Yeah, so that's what the series, that's about 26LG. And before I conclude, I would like to, and my series, and before I conclude my presentation and move on to questions, I would like to anticipate a question. Some people might be wondering, if we've digitized the analog originals, are we still pulling the originals for the research room? And the short answer to that question is no. We digitize to provide digital copies of the photos to our researchers. We digitize so that people who don't have the ability to come into our research room can still access the images. We digitize for access, but we also digitize to protect and preserve the records. And we want to prevent them from unnecessary light and handling, the potential of being damaged by accident. And so continuing to pull records that we have digitized begins to defeat the part of the purpose of digitization. The photos in still pictures, the photos in 26LG, those photos are our history. These photos are here for the American people. It is our right to see these images, but it's also our responsibility to preserve them and protect them for all of the Americans yet to come, because these photos are here for them as well. I very strongly believe in the value of protecting and preserving our photographs and our historic records for your children and your children's children and for everyone. And so that's why I'm so excited about digitization, because that does that. Digitization is a step towards that. And I do realize that this might have been slightly disappointing for some people, and I don't want to end my presentation on a note that may disappoint researchers, because I think digitization is awesome. So I would like to conclude with an exciting note for the future and talk about how Cartographic, the branch, is digitizing their Record Group 26 Lighthouse materials. The series is called Lighthouse Plans and Maps, 1793 through 1939, and the local identifier, which is important, as we now all know, is 026 Light. So this is an ongoing digitization project. They currently have about 1,200 images available online, but they have all of the metadata for the records online already, so you can go see what will be loaded eventually. And ultimately, I believe they're going to put about 3,000 more images up there. And so it's very exciting. The images are super cool. I was looking at them recently. They're very exciting. And I very much hope that these records will be very complementary, or our photos will be complementary to these records when people go in to research lighthouses, that they can use these records together so you can see the plans and maps and the final product. And so that pretty much concludes my presentation. I really think everybody should be on the lookout for these photos that are coming up. And if anybody has any questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelsey. I love these images. If we have any questions from the audience, we ask that you make your way to the aisle microphones so that we can capture your voice. In the meanwhile, I have a few questions that came from our online audience. I have one gentleman ask, I'm going to make this a two-part question. Someone asked, when did the project start? And then another person asked, how long did the project take?
Those are very good questions. Those are very good questions even for me, because I was not the POC at the start of this project. I believe in the end, it took a couple of years, because we began the project and then there was a period of time where I'm not sure why, but there was a lull. And so we picked the project back up, and it was a couple of months from the time that I became POC on the project to the end. But it's a good question of how long it took, and that's the reason why it was kind of a while.
So how long did it take? How long have you been the point of contact for the project?
Well, the project was completed last year, and I think it was about 6 to 8 months, but I'm trying to remember back 2 years now.
Fair enough. Well, we're looking forward to these the cartographics project. It looks like we have a question from our on-site audience.
How you doing? I'm still confused with the identifier. Couldn't you just type in on the National Archives website lighthouses and it comes up, or?
That is a great question. Yes, you can. You can type in lighthouses. When that happens, though, there are more records at the National Archives about lighthouses than just these. So there might be other photos. There are definitely going to be textual records. Now there are cartographic records. So if you type in lighthouses, you will be drawing from all of the holdings.
So that's just for the specific one?
That's for these. If you want to see these ones, that's how to get it.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have another question from our online audience. If anybody here has questions from the theater, we'll make your way to the microphone. I have a question. So these are Coast Guard lighthouse photographs because they're federal records. I have a question asking, are these all of the lighthouse pictures that the National Archives has?
No, they are not. We have a couple of, I haven't really investigated the series, but I know that there are a couple of other series that have lighthouses, I think in the, from different, in 26, that are newer photos. But we also have lighthouses that could be in any number of different series because we have records from the Navy, we have records from the Coast Guard, we have aerial photos. So they're not the only lighthouse photos, but it is one of our bigger, more impressive ones.
Thank you. Looks like we have an on-site audience question.
Yes, and I had another question about the identifier number. One of the examples I believe you had up was like 28 LG 478. I was wondering, you explained the 28 and the LG, but I was wondering if the 4 and the 78, whether that described the lighthouse district and maybe the box number, or were they something else?
That's a good question, and it actually describes the 4 would be the box number,
Oh, okay.
and then the other number, that would be the number of the image in that box.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very
Sure.
much.
I have a follow-up question. This is a great question from
Oh.
Richard Boyden. He asks, does each image at the have a National Archives identifier as well as a local identifier? Does each image have both identifiers?
Let's see if I can go find so I'm guessing that means like the National Archives identifier number here and the local identifier. Every image will have the National Archives identifier number associated with it, but I'm not sure. That's the, that may be the series level. I'm looking at my mentor. I think that might be at the series level. The way that our research staff, what's really important to know is that if you want to talk to our research staff about it, you need the local identifier number, because the local identifier number is what is physically on the print. So even if they could use the archives identifier number to get to this particular image in the catalog, they're not going to be able to use it to, they're not going to, they can, it's an extra step, it's more work, but what's on the photo is 26 LG, and that's how you would find it in the box.
Thank you. That's a great answer and good question. We have a question from Beth online. She asks, do you have a favorite photo or lighthouse that you came across?
Yes.
I'm hoping you used it in this presentation.
I did. I would have to, this is one of them. I don't know how to get back there. It's back here somewhere. So my favorite photo is of the Portland headlight, and it's this one on the left. Because when I was a kid, my family went there a couple of times, and I think it looks almost exactly the same in color, though. I think it's really amazing to see places that you have been in person represented in history, and that's why this one's my favorite.
I
Thank
have a
you.
question about that one.
Sure.
Isn't that two different pictures of two
It-
different lighthouses?
It is two different lighthouses, but it's of the same place,
Gotcha.
I believe. And these photos were undated, but I would imagine that this is most certainly an older photo, and this is a more modern is relative photo. So it's of the same location, but probably this one got knocked down. I think that was relatively common for the lighthouses to be destroyed and be rebuilt. So that's what I assume, but you'd have to do research on that to be sure. And if you do research, that would be amazing. Let me know the answer.
We love citizen archivists who add information like that to our records. We actually encourage you to use our History Hub for that very purpose. And I have my own question, unless we have one from the audience. So my question is, I noticed when you were going through the slides that at least one looked like it was a postcard.
Yes.
And I was wondering if that actually was a postcard, and was that in the records? Did you find it that way?
It was in the records. This was not something that we added. It was transferred over from the Coast Guard. I believe it's a postcard. I did not pull it in order to see the back, but it looks like a postcard, and it is a drawing of this house. So some of our records, we do have some drawings or graphic material in still pictures, and because this was transferred over along with all of the photos, it is considered one of our records.
Thank you so much. And I'll give us a moment to see if there's any more questions. If not, I will make my way up there so I'm not a disembodied voice. Thank you. So I'm going to bring us to the end. So please know that this presentation is also going to be a video recording, and the handout will remain available on this YouTube webpage, so you can go back and take a look at it. And there's also the presentation slides. There's the handout, which is a blog that Kelsey did last year. And we also ask that you take a moment. Very short evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback. We use it for future programming. And we really appreciate your taking that time to do that. So on behalf of the National Archives and our presenter, thank you for joining us today. This concludes our presentation. Thank you.